Welcome to a deep dive into ancient India. We're going to be talking about cultural developments from 600 BCE to 600 CE. And let me tell you, this is a period just packed with fascinating stuff. We're going to be uncovering the world of ancient Indian thinkers, what they believed in, and the amazing structures they built. We're talking philosophical debates. We're talking the rise of Buddhism and Jainism and all sorts of awe-inspiring architecture.
Yeah, it's so fascinating to consider this era. I mean, think about it. Between 600 BCE and 600 CE, the world was really going through the surge of new philosophical and religious ideas. It was a time of real upheaval,
Yeah.
real change, and people were searching for answers, to the big questions in life.
And in India, all these big questions were being asked while everything around them was shifting. You had political power changing hands, you had cities growing, and it just changes in how society was structured. It was like a breeding ground for all these new developments.
Exactly. All of that change, all that uncertainty, it made people reevaluate everything. They started questioning the existing norms, looking for meaning, looking for purpose in a world that just felt so much more complex.
So let's unpack this a little bit. Before we dive headfirst into Buddhism and Jainism, our sources talk about the Vedic tradition that was already well established in India. It sounds like rituals and sacrifices were pretty central to that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you look at the Rig Veda, it's one of the oldest Hindu texts, and you see this society that's, they're just completely immersed in these rituals. The goal was to please all sorts of different deities.
And what were they hoping to get out of it?
Oh, practical things mostly. Good health, wealth, children, a nice long life, the good stuff you know.
So not really those more philosophical quests we usually think of when it comes to ancient thinkers. Did this focus ever change?
It did, actually. By the 6th century BCE, we see these things called the Upanishads emerge. And they represent a real shift in focus. They become more concerned with philosophical questions, questions about the self, the cycle of rebirth, and, the very nature of reality itself.
Okay, so picture this. It's ancient India, and you're sitting in a simple hut, maybe under a tree. And there are these intense debates happening all around you. People are talking about life, death, the universe, and teachers like Mahavira and the Buddha, they're challenging the authority of the Vedas, offering these radical new perspectives.
What's so significant here is that it really emphasizes individual agency. These guys, they were proposing a total shift in how people saw their lives. The idea that you could shape your own destiny no matter your social standing was revolutionary, especially in a society so defined by caste and the strict social hierarchy.
I mean, it's pretty mind-blowing. People were being told they could break free from those constraints. So what exactly were the core principles of these new ways of thinking?
Well, Jainism, for example, with Mahavira as their key figure, they really put this idea of ahimsa front and center, nonviolence, basically. And this really resonated in Indian thought. It still has an impact even today.
And when we talk about nonviolence in Jainism, we're not just talking about being nice to each other, are we? I mean, it goes way deeper than that, right?
Oh, yeah, way deeper. Jainism takes it to another level. They believe all living beings, even rocks and water, have souls.
Wow, even rocks and water.
Exactly. For them, the universe is interconnected, just teeming with life. So non-injury becomes like the most important thing.
So you're saying that even stepping on a stone could be an ethical dilemma?
Pretty much. Every action, every thought has consequences. It all contributes to this thing called karma, and that shapes our journey through the cycle of birth, death, and rebirth.
So to break free from that cycle, what did Jainism propose?
Renunciation and a strict life of asceticism. They really believe in minimizing harm, detaching from material possessions, basically purifying your soul by living a very simple, very disciplined life.
It sounds a lot like monastic life as a key part of spiritual liberation. That's something we'll see with Buddhism as well. But before we get into that, let's talk about the Buddha himself. His life was a journey in itself, wasn't it?
You could say that. Born as Siddhartha, he was a prince, lived a life of privilege and luxury, totally shielded from the harsh realities of the world, until one day he has this series of encounters. An old man, someone who was sick, a corpse, and finally this serene ascetic. They completely changed his perspective.
That's a powerful image. It really makes you think about the moments that change how we see the world. So what did Siddhartha do after that?
Well, those encounters were so powerful that he renounced his comfortable life and embarked on this quest for enlightenment. He explored different paths, even pushed himself to extremes with severe asceticism. But in the end, he realized that true enlightenment was about moderation. It's what we now call the middle way.
So he was really wrestling with these huge questions about life and suffering, trying different things until he found his own path through introspection and meditation. That's remarkable.
Right. And the core of his insights were captured in these things called the Four Noble Truths.
Okay, I'm all ears. What are those?
The first one is that life inherently involves suffering. The second is that the suffering comes from attachment and desire. Third, that this suffering can actually end. And fourth, that there's a path to end suffering called the Eightfold Path.
So it sounds like he wasn't trying to prove or disprove the existence of God or anything like that. He was offering this practical approach to navigate life's complexities and find a way to alleviate suffering.
Exactly. And his teachings resonated with people from all walks of life. Buddhism, much like Jainism, emphasized ethical conduct and compassion, both in the monastic community, the Sangha, and in society as a whole. It was all about mental discipline, right action, and mindfulness as core parts of this path.
So it gave people hope, a sense of agency in a world that could feel pretty chaotic and overwhelming. And it's incredible that this message spread so widely, attracting followers from all sorts of backgrounds. Tell me a bit more about this Sangha. It sounds like it had a really unique social structure.
It did. It was the community of monks and nuns, and within this community there were no social distinctions. Everyone was considered equal. It didn't matter what caste you were born into or your previous social standing, which was radical at the time.
Yeah, especially considering how rigid that hierarchy was in ancient India. But didn't the Sangha initially only allow men to join? How did that change?
You're right. At first it was only open to men, but one of the Buddha's closest disciples, Ananda, really pushed for women to be allowed to join as nuns. They were called bhikkhunis.
It's amazing to think there were people advocating for inclusivity, even back then. So who was the first woman to be ordained as a bhikkhuni?
It was Mahapajapati Gautami, the Buddha's own foster mother, actually. And her joining paved the way for tons of women to dedicate themselves to the Buddhist path and become teachers themselves.
Now, our sources mention this collection of verses called the Therigatha. It's a collection of verses written by these early Buddhist nuns, and it gives us a glimpse into what their lives were like, the challenges they faced. Is there any particular story that comes to mind?
Oh, there's this one about Puna. She was a slave woman. Imagine her life. Fetching water from the river every day, enduring the cold, the harsh treatment from her superiors. One day, she meets a Brahmin performing rituals in the icy water.
I'm intrigued. Did she accept his teachings?
She didn't just blindly accept anything. Puna actually questioned the Brahmin's beliefs. She challenges the idea that just washing yourself in water could cleanse you of your wrongdoings. And she does it with wit, even points out that if that were true, all the frogs and turtles living in the water would be destined for a good rebirth.
It seems like she embodies that critical thinking the Buddha's teachings encouraged. It's inspiring to see how his message resonated with people who were marginalized and searching for liberation, regardless of their social status.
Absolutely. And speaking of spaces that fostered this sense of liberation and connection to something bigger than yourself, our exploration now takes us to the fascinating world of stupas. Before Buddhism even came around, there were certain places in nature that held real significance for people in ancient India. Think groves of trees, unusual rock formations, places of natural beauty.
Like natural points of power where people felt a connection to something bigger than themselves. Do those places have a specific name?
They were often marked by these little shrines and called chaityas. As Buddhism emerged, places connected to the Buddha's life, like his birthplace and where he reached enlightenment, those became incredibly important too. And then you have stupas.
Stupas. They seem to have a really special place in Buddhism. And they weren't just like burial mounds or anything, were they?
Nope. Stupas evolved into powerful symbols of the Buddha's teachings and the whole path to enlightenment. Their architecture really changed over time, from simple mounds with relics to elaborate structures with these intricate carvings and all these symbolic elements.
I'm picturing them in my mind. These massive structures, starting as these simple earthen mounds and then evolving into these elaborate things covered in sculptures. They must have been incredible focal points for the growing Buddhist communities. What can you tell me about their design?
Well, the early stupas, like those at Sanchi and Bharhut, they were fairly simple. There was a central mound called the Amtara, which held the relics, and it was surrounded by a railing, which symbolized the separation between the sacred and the secular.
And of course, there were those incredible gateways, often covered in carvings depicting scenes from the Buddha's life and his teachings. It must have been such a moving experience, approaching a stupa, walking around it clockwise, like following the path of the sun.
It was a key ritual. It's called circumambulation. And yeah, it symbolized the journey towards enlightenment. And as the stupas became more elaborate, they added more elements, like the harmika, this balcony-like structure on top of the atanda, which represented the home of the gods. and the yashti, a central mast that often have an umbrella on top, symbolizing the axis of the world.
Wow. So stupas weren't just these static structures. They were dynamic spaces that helped people in their spiritual practice, these powerful reminders of the Buddha's message. But there's another layer to their story, their discovery by Europeans in the 18th and 19th centuries, and what happened as a result. Some of them met a tragic end, didn't they?
They did, sadly. And that's something we'll pick up next time. We'll explore the contrasting fates of Amaravati and Sanchi. One is a story of loss, the other a testament to preservation. So yeah, this whole idea of Europeans discovering these ancient stupas, it's a complicated story. It's got this mix of awe and wonder at finding these lost treasures, but also, unfortunately, a lot of loss and destruction too. Let's start with Amaravati. It was this magnificent stupa located in what's now Andhra Pradesh. And, well, it's a bit of a cautionary tale about why preserving cultural heritage is so important.
It's hard to even imagine something as impressive as a stupa being lost. What exactly happened at Amaravati?
Well, it all started back in 1796 when this local Raja stumbles across the ruins. And he sees it as a source of, building materials, maybe a place to find some hidden treasure. Then, a few decades later, British officials come onto the scene.
And that's when things go downhill.
Right. Unfortunately, yeah. Instead of appreciating the historical and artistic value of the site, these officials, caught up in this whole colonial mindset, they start taking sculptures and panels from the stupa. It's a classic example of what we now call the loot and plunder era of archaeology.
It's a reminder that studying the past hasn't always been done with sensitivity or respect. To think that these intricate works of art, meant to be part of a larger whole, got scattered across collections, some even shipped off to Europe. It's heartbreaking.
One British official, Walter Elliot, even gave his name to a collection of these Amaravati marbles. He acknowledged the stupa's grandeur, but still, he took part in dismantling it.
It seems like back then, there wasn't this awareness of preserving these sites as they were. But not everyone felt that way, did they? Our sources mention this archaeologist, H.H. Cole, who had a totally different approach.
Cole was ahead of his time. He really pushed for keeping archaeological sites in situ, which means leaving the artifacts where they were found. He thought museums could just display plaster casts instead of taking the original pieces.
He sounds like he understood how important context is in archaeology. So how did people respond to his ideas?
Sadly, his calls to save Amaravati were ignored. But his work did play a big role in preserving another incredible stupa, Sanchi.
Ah, Sanchi. The stupa with those amazing carved gateways we talked about earlier. It's a World Heritage Site today, so obviously things turned out differently there. What happened?
Well, when Sanchi was discovered in 1818, it was still in pretty good shape. 3 gateways were standing, and the 4th one was nearby. It had fallen at some point, but there were people who still wanted to take it apart and send those gateways to Europe.
It sounds like Sanchi was in danger of suffering the same fate as Amaravati. What saved it?
Well, a few things. Cole's push for keeping things in situ was starting to gain some traction. But the most important factor was probably the rulers of Bhopal, Shah Jahan Begum, and her successor, Sultan Jahan Begum. They stepped in.
It's amazing how individuals, especially those in power, can make a real difference. What did the Begums do to protect Sanchi?
They saw how historically important Sanchi was and used their influence and resources to make sure it was preserved. They funded the site's upkeep, supported the archaeological work being done there, and even helped set up a museum at Sanchi.
It's a relief to hear a story about cultural heritage actually being saved. Thanks to their efforts, we can still experience the wonder of Sanchi today. So let's shift gears a little and talk about those intricate sculptures that decorate stupas like Sanchi. They weren't just for decoration, right? They actually told stories.
Absolutely. Imagine them as ancient comic strips or visual narratives carved in stone. They brought stories from the Buddha's life and his teachings to life, especially for those who couldn't read.
It's a window into what people believed, what they imagined all those years ago. Our sources mention one sculpture in particular. It might seem like a simple rural scene at first glance, but it's actually depicting a story from the Vesantara Jataka. What can you tell me about that?
Oh, the Vesantara Jataka, that's a great one. It tells the story of this prince, Vesantara, who is famous for his generosity. He ends up giving everything away, even his own family, to a Brahmin, and eventually is living in poverty in the forest. It's this ultimate act of selflessness and compassion. And that sculpture at Sanchi, it captures this key moment in the story, showing the prince's total commitment to his ideals.
So to really understand these sculptures, you have to know the stories they're depicting. It's like a puzzle where the visual and the textual clues work together to tell you the meaning.
Exactly. And sometimes the clues were more symbolic. Early Buddhist art often used symbols to represent the Buddha instead of showing him directly. Like you might see an empty seat under a tree, and that signifies his meditation and enlightenment.
That's really interesting. Why do you think they chose to represent the Buddha symbolically rather than showing him directly?
It seems like they were trying to emphasize the essence of his teachings, the idea that he transcended the physical realm. They wanted people to think about the deeper meaning instead of focusing on what he looked like. The stupa itself became the symbol of the Buddha's parinirvana, his final release from the cycle of birth and death.
It's incredible how these early artists conveyed such complex ideas through symbolism. But it wasn't all just Buddhist stories and symbols, was it? I'm thinking of those stunning carvings of women swinging from trees. The Shalapanjikas. They seem a bit out of place in a context focused on renunciation and enlightenment, don't they?
That's where things get even more interesting. These Shalapanjikas, they were believed to make trees blossom just by touching them, and they probably represent how pre-Buddhist beliefs and motifs were being woven into Buddhist art. It reminds us that changes in religion and culture are rarely straightforward.
It's like this blending of different worldviews, with popular imagery finding its way into this evolving Buddhist framework. It shows that even as new religions were emerging, they often absorbed and reinterpreted elements from the traditions that came before them.
And this process of adaptation and evolution, it's key to understanding how both Buddhism and Hinduism developed during this time period. You see new ideas and practices challenging existing norms, but also building on what was already there.
So what were some of the big changes happening within Buddhism itself? Our sources mention a new form called Mahayana Buddhism. Can you tell me more about that?
Around the 1st century CE, Mahayana Buddhism, sometimes called the Great Vehicle, emerged. And they introduced this concept that completely changed Buddhist thought, the Bodhisattva.
Okay, I'm curious. What makes Bodhisattva so special?
Bodhisattvas are these individuals who've reached a really high level of enlightenment, but they choose to delay their own final liberation so they can help others achieve the same. It's a pretty profound act of compassion and selflessness.
Wow, imagine dedicating your life to helping others become enlightened. It sounds challenging, but also deeply fulfilling.
Definitely. And this idea of a compassionate savior figure wasn't just limited to Buddhism either. Around the same time, Hinduism was also changing quite a bit, especially within the worship of Vishnu and Shiva, Vaishnavism and Shaivism.
So we're seeing these parallel developments happening in both Buddhism and Hinduism. What were some of the key shifts in these Hindu traditions?
One of the biggest was the growing importance of bhakti, or devotion. It became a central part of religious practice. It's all about nurturing a deep personal connection with the deity you choose to worship.
So instead of just performing rituals, it was about building a real relationship with the divine. Did this affect how people worshipped Vishnu and Shiva?
Totally. Worshipping Vishnu's avatars, his incarnations, became increasingly popular. Each avatar represents a different aspect of his power, and they come to Earth to restore order and fight evil.
So each avatar has this specific mission, which makes this idea of a supreme god more relatable, easier to understand for people. What about Shiva? How was he being worshipped during this period?
Well, Shiva was often represented by the linga, the symbol of his creative power. But he was also shown in human form, often with multiple arms, embodying his multifaceted nature. The Puranas, these collections of stories and myths about Shiva and Vishnu, they played a huge role in shaping Hindu beliefs and practices during this era.
It's amazing how these texts, along with the changing ways people worshipped, helped create a more unified Hindu tradition across India. And around this time, we also see this huge shift in religious architecture, right? The move from stupas to temples.
Exactly. While people continued to build and revere stupas, the first Hindu temples started to appear. They were specifically designed to house images of deities. These early temples were pretty simple structures, often just a square room called the Garbhagriha.
So that Garbhagriha was the heart of the temple, the most sacred space where the deity actually resided.
Exactly. It was the innermost sanctuary, the focal point of worship. And over time, temple architecture got more and more elaborate. They started adding towering shikharas or spires, along with other structures like assembly halls and gateways. And here's something interesting. Some of the earliest temples were actually carved right out of solid rock. Like, they were basically artificial caves.
Wait, temples carved out of caves? That's incredible. Tell me more about that.
These cave temples are amazing examples of the skill and creativity of ancient Indian builders. They took these natural caves and transformed them into sacred spaces, creating these awe-inspiring structures that fit right in with the natural environment. The most impressive example of this is the Kailashanatha Temple at Ellora. It's an absolute masterpiece, carved out of a single rock.
Wow. The amount of work and devotion that must have gone into creating something like that, it says so much about the beliefs and the artistic vision of the people who built it.
Absolutely. It really is a wonder to behold. But as amazing as all these structures and sculptures are, it makes you wonder, can we ever truly understand what they really meant to the people who created them all those centuries ago?
That's a question that's always there when you study history, isn't it? We have all these physical remains, the texts, the inscriptions, but there's always this layer of mystery. It's like we're detectives trying to solve a puzzle, but with lots of pieces missing.
I know, right? And we have to admit that there are limits to what we can know. There's so much that's lost to time, all sorts of rituals, beliefs, everyday practices that just faded away, leaving no trace for us to find. What we can see, as impressive as it is really just a tiny fragment of this huge, intricate tapestry that was ancient Indian culture.
It's a humbling thought. Even with all our modern tools and technology, we're really just scratching the surface of these complex, fascinating civilizations. But that's what makes studying history so exciting. There's always something new to discover, to learn, to think about. What do you think are some of the biggest unanswered questions about ancient India? The things that still intrigue historians and archaeologists today?
Yeah, it really makes you realize just how much we don't know. There are so many unanswered questions about ancient India, all these mysteries waiting to be solved, and that's what makes exploring the past so captivating.
It reminds us that history is never really finished. It's always evolving. As we find new artifacts, translate ancient text, develop new technology, our understanding of what happened in the past changes too.
And it's not just about finding the facts and dates. It's about understanding how people who lived so long ago thought and felt and experienced the world. What did they worry about? What were they striving for? What did they see when they looked around them? Trying to answer those questions is humbling, but it's also incredibly inspiring. We can look at the buildings they built, the art they created, the things they wrote down, but we'll never truly be able to walk in their shoes or fully grasp the richness of their lives.
This deep dive into ancient India has really made me think about that. It's amazing to see these people grappling with questions we still ask ourselves today. The nature of reality, the meaning of life, the search for inner peace, the idea that everything is connected.
It shows how powerful human thought and creativity can be. These ideas, conceived thousands of years ago, still resonate with us. They make us think differently, challenge our assumptions, and explore new ways of understanding the world and our place in it.
It really does. It makes you think about the ideas and the things we're creating today. What will they say about us thousands of years from now? What will future historians think about our beliefs, our values, our accomplishments, and our failures?
It's a good question. What stories will our ruins tell? What messages will people see in our art? Will they see us as a society that embraced compassion and wisdom, or one that gave in to greed and conflict?
It feels like we've come full circle in this deep dive. The past isn't just a bunch of old facts and dates. It shapes who we are and the world we live in, even today.
And it's a good reminder that we're all part of this much bigger story, a story that goes back thousands of years and will keep going long after we're gone.
So to our listeners, as you go about your lives, remember to look for those echoes of the past all around you. They're there in the buildings we use every day, the stories we tell, the values we hold dear, the choices we make.
Never stop questioning, exploring, and being amazed by the mysteries of human history. Who knows what amazing things we'll discover in the future?
Thank you for joining us on this journey through ancient India. Until next time, keep diving deep.